The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the Sea of Galilee while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, and by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far off from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. When he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Grace, peace, and mercy are yours from the triune God. Amen. All of the readings for today are about God speaking, and God's people listening, hearing, and responding. And though I almost always focus on the gospel text in my sermon, as I was mulling over the text for this week, the story of Elijah in the cave from 1 Kings felt important for us. Elijah, if you remember, is one of the main prophets of Israel. He is definitely one of the most famous ones. When we celebrate the Transfiguration, where Jesus becomes otherworldly and shiny on top of the mountains, and the disciples want to build some booths, one of the people that appear with Jesus is Elijah and Moses. So Elijah is there. When Jesus asks his disciples earlier in the book, "Who do people say I am?" one of the wrong answers the disciples give is the second coming of Elijah. Elijah is really important to understanding the Hebrew Scriptures and honestly the gospel and what Jesus is all about. So what is Elijah up to anyway? Elijah is running for his life. It's really messy, but essentially, because Israel has not been living up to their end of the covenant, Elijah has held them accountable, which is what all prophets tend to do. And now he is on the run because kings don't like being told what to do by measly little prophets. So they set off to kill him. But he runs and hides in a cave. So now Elijah is feeling so alone. There is nobody in his corner. Elijah has tried to be faithful. He has worked hard and done what God has asked him. And in return, what does he get? The army chasing him down to try and take his life. So he hides in a cave. Not such a nice place for someone like Elijah, because who hides in caves in the mountains? People on the run. Who is on the run? Criminals. Like him, kind of. But worse, people who would hurt him. It's dangerous, but less dangerous than an army. But he is frantic now, and cold and nervous, and very likely without very much hope of anything getting better for him. This is the end of the line for him. There is no Calvary, but God calls out to him in his time of need. God tells him to go out of the cave and listen and wait, because God is going to pass by. So Elijah goes out to the entrance of the cave. And what happens next is pretty incredible. There is a wind so strong that it splits the rocks into pieces. And there is an earthquake that shakes the foundations of the world, and there is a fire that sweeps across the face of the mountains. And after each one, the text says that God was not in the fire or the wind or the earthquake, but after all those things pass by, God shows up in sheer silence. So big whoop, Pastor. Who cares? We know this story. God was not in all that stuff. He was in the still and quiet voice, right? Yes, but there is so much more here. All the ways that Elijah thought God might show up was how Israel was used to God's presence being shown. Strong wind, fire, earthquake. Think pillar of fire in the wilderness. Think separating the Red Seas. Think smoke. Think the walls of Jericho falling. This is how Elijah expected God to show up. This is how Elijah expected to experience God. This is how God's presence was supposed to be felt. But that is not what happens. Imagine being Elijah. God is supposed to pass by and reveal God's self to him, and so he is on the lookout for what has worked before, how his ancestors have experienced God in the stories. He is looking for something big, something direct. And when that doesn't happen in that time between those big events of fire, earthquake, and wind, I bet he gets a little concerned. He is expecting one thing, but he gets another. It's cool that it happens in the silence, but this text is doing more than asking us to be quiet and still. This text is showing that God acts in surprising and new ways, unexpected ways. God's voice, God's presence shows up in the least expected places sometimes, in ways that it has never shown up like before. In this case, God shows up in silence, in complete, utter void of sound. The exact opposite of what Elijah was looking for. And then when God's presence is known, God promises Elijah allies when he desperately, desperately needs it. God reminds him that there is still 7,000 who remain faithful. God offers direction and encouragement, which is exactly what he needs. But again, it's in the very least expected way. This is my last Sunday here at St. Mark's. After today, I will not be your pastor. But I am thankful for my time here because God has shown up. But God has not always shown up where I expected God to show up. People have surprised me. People who have seemed prickly have revealed their softness and gentle hearts. People who like to pretend they have nothing to contribute and downplay themselves have blown me away in discussions with deep, deep theological insights. People who I didn't think were going to show up for the church have stepped up to the plate. And sometimes I was looking for God to be revealed in one place, but then misdirect, God shows up in an exact opposite place where I was looking. It's been wild. And what has assured me is that this story about Elijah in the cave is a true story. And it remains true to all of us. This church is on a journey, dear friends, in a lot of ways. And we are in on it together. And I am sure that like Elijah, or honestly like the disciples In the boat with the big waves, for that matter, it might feel like it's all too much sometimes. It might feel like each one of us is all alone sometimes. Elijah says, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets. I alone am left. He is all alone. He isn't, though. He just feels that way, which is a totally normal thing to feel. Sometimes it might feel frantic. We might be a little scared. We might feel like hiding in a cave like Elijah, or in the bottom of a boat from the big scary waves like the disciples, and we will look for God's help in the usual places, in the ways we have found God before, the things that have worked for the church in the past. And we will grip onto that way, that leadership style, that way of doing church, that way of managing our stress and anxiety, because people are anxious people. And when they are anxious, they go to what they know. That is human nature. But if we are to take the story from Elijah seriously, which we should, God promises two things. The first thing he promises is to show up. God promises to be with us, Emmanuel, to help us in our time of need. And the second thing that God promises in this story is that it will be surprising and new and different and strange and unexpected. As I am leaving, my encouragement to you is to position yourself like Elijah, to witness God, to be on the lookout, because God will show up. But do not be dismissive of God showing up in a new way, in a way that God's presence has never been seen or felt here at St. Mark's. Who knows what it could look like? Elijah surely expected fire or wind or earthquake, but that is not how God was revealed to Elijah. In fact, it was something new and different, the exact opposite of what he was looking for. God is going to show up here because God has been showing up here. But maybe it won't look the same as it always has. Maybe God is being revealed in something new and different, something we have never tried before, a different kind of leadership style, something you expected to hate, a new friend, a new ministry, new way of being. Who knows? We worship a God of surprising and unexpected presence, whose wild goodness and creativity brings to nothing our expectations. Let us stay awake, watch, and listen for the God who shows up in the unexpected. Amen.